of the best things you can do. Oh yeah, we're live now.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, let's kick off. I know some of us are coming in, but I will just get rolling. Beautiful. So, um, some of the kids these days might refer to what is about to happen as the honey pot, which is effectively, you think you're coming in for one thing, and we're going to be talking about something different, because when Katie Bryan, another one of our incredible school counselors, reached out, she's like, you were over at the school in earlier last year in the fall, at the start of the school year, and we're talking with some of our students about relationships, attachment style. Like, we'd love for you to talk the same thing about parents. Um, but here's the honeypot, the trick. You've been rused. We're actually here to talk about another relationship today, not their relationships, because as we'll kick off, the most important relationship education that your teen will ever receive isn't happening in health class. It's not coming from social media. It isn't even coming from their friends. It's happening at your dinner table. It's happening in the car, in the 30 seconds after you and your partner disagree in front of them. Your kids are building their blueprint for love by watching you. Isn't that fun? So I'm Mike McCabe. As Brooke said, I'm a couples and men's relationship therapist here in Westlake. Um, and my wife and I and our kid and our family are part of this community. I've got a 6-month-old future Westlake chap at home. And it's really important for me because I live here, work here, and just to be a part of this conversation. Because I think it's maybe the most important conversation we could have about any relationships right now. So, like I said, when Katie had asked me out here, I thought this whole conversation could probably be boiled down to one question, one slide. I won't do that to Brooke and Katie because that would be, you know, we'd have a lot more stuff to talk about. But if the only thing that we talked about today or got into today when it came to relationships, and again, the blueprint or the template that we're giving our teen, it's this. Would you want your kid, your teen, to have your relationship? And again, it would be very easy for us to sit here and I think rightfully throw shade at what our kids are seeing on something like social media or the influence of friends who are maybe growing up a little too fast, what they're seeing in movies, Netflix, and all this stuff. It'd be a complete waste of time if we didn't address the elephant in the room, which is the influence of your relationship, the adult romantic relationship in the house. So, a clarifier. This conversation today isn't a guilt trip. We're not in the business of being perfect people or having a perfect relationship because those don't exist. But it is an invitation. My hope is that it's for us to take an honest look at what your kids are actually absorbing from your relationship every single day. So we'll start high level, big picture, zooming out for a moment, because understandably, as parents, we spend an enormous amount of energy worrying about what our kids are exposed to outside of the house on the externals, again, the social media, academic pressure, peer influence. And those things, of course, matter, right? But when we look at decades of developmental psychology, one pattern shows up again and again. And it's the quality of the parent's relationship is what predicts long-term relational outcomes for children more strongly than any other variable. Not parenting style, not school quality, not income, it's the marriage itself. And that means that the relationship becomes the emotional climate that our kids grow up inside. And again, we'll say it again. We're not here trying to model or give these kids a perfect relationship because that's impossible. But we are here to show them that a relationship can grow together and certainly repair together. So, an important clarifier again, this isn't about conflict or lack of conflict. A name you will hear me mention a couple times today, John Gottman, him and his wife Julie are the all-time greats of not only couples therapy, but couples therapy research. They've got a very famous, what they call their love lab out in Seattle. They've studied thousands of couples, I think since like the early 70s, decades of research. And their findings are remarkably consistent. You know, the strongest predictor of divorce has absolutely nothing to do with conflict. Conflict and divorce are not correlated in any important way. What is the strongest predictor of divorce? It's contempt. And contempt, maybe the simplest way of putting it is, I don't like you as a person, you know, and that might look like eye rolling when this other person says something we disagree with, dismissiveness, sarcasm being used as a weapon, the chronic irritation and frustration that never really gets repaired. But we're not all doom and gloom here. There's a hopeful part. The strongest protective factor in the marriage, again, not the absence of conflict. That's not the biggest indicator. It's the repair. And again, I know we're here talking about our relationships, but certainly if we're talking about the gift or the model or the template that we're trying to give our kids, that's a cornerstone of it. It's repair. That's the ability to say, you know what, that didn't go well. Or I got reactive. I'm sorry. Or can we take a break or reset? And we're going to spend a little more in-depth time on repair throughout the course of this presentation. We're just prefacing here, But again, when our kids see that conflict is followed by repair, they're not internalizing fear, confusion. They're internalizing resilience, which I think is I'd put up there with just about anything of what we're trying to build and develop in our kids, because they see that when we disconnect, we can come back to homeostasis. We can come back to connection. So, and this kind of, as I had prefaced earlier, when I had gone to Westlake earlier last fall, talked to some of your kids and students about attachment styles. This ties right into attachment theory, you know. And if that's not a familiar term, I think the simplest way of putting it is this. Attachment theory simply says we as humans, we learn what love feels like way before we can explain it. Long before your kid is going to articulate a belief or a thought about what a relationship might look like or what it should feel like, their nervous systems are answering some simple but profoundly fundamental questions, which I've listed here on the slide. Our nervous systems are being wired from a very young age to answer these questions. Am I safe? Am I worthy of love? And even when we disconnect, does connection return? And psychologists call these internal working models, which is just a clinical way of saying we all very much embedded in our nervous system, in our brains, and our hearts. We have a template for how love should look. We have a template for what love should feel like, you know. And most parents, understandably, assume that attachment or just a good relationship with our kids is formed primarily by how we treat them. And that's, of course, partly true. That's in the mixture, that's in the formula. But attachment is also very acutely formed by what children repeatedly observe between their parents. And whether we want to admit it or not, our kids, your teenager, is watching how your all's love handles tension, arguments, stress, disagreements, disconnection. Does it withdraw? Does it ramp up the cycle of conflict? Or whether it repairs, And of course, our kids are not, they don't have I don't think, the cognitive capacity to really consciously analyze some of this stuff, and it's probably not top of mind for them. They've got way more stuff on their plate right now, but their nervous system is taking notes of what this feels like. What's the emotional temperature in the house? And they're not just learning whether they're loved, they're learning how love should look, how it behaves. So, what I see in my work here in Westlake, working with couples, working with men, there's three very common household patterns that I see repeatedly. The first one we might call the efficient household. This might look like two very competent adults. The house runs like a German clock. The schedules are tight. No one's late for school or soccer or debate. And there's no dramatic fights, but there's very little warmth. Kids raised in this environment often grow up believing that marriage is functional, it's practical, but emotionally thin. And this household teaches our kids that marriage, again, it's just kind of a practical, like a box to check. It's practical, makes sense, logical, you know. But maybe a little on a sadder note, it's that love is just something you got to manage or maybe even fit into your schedule. It's not something you feel. And kids from this household often grow up to be really capable, successful, um, but the quality of their relationships, they struggle to be present in them. Then in the middle here, we've got the high intensity household. And these are the big arguments, big fights, big reconciliations, big dramatic displays of either affection or um, hurt, big emotions. And the love is obvious, but the stability, less obvious. And this household teaches kids that love is intense, but ultimately unstable. And that connection often requires drama, often requires a little gasoline to feel real. Kids from these households often find calm relationships a little boring. And unconsciously, they might create conflict in their own relationships to feel close. Now, lastly, here we've got the quiet drift. And again, this is one of those no crisis. The alarm bells aren't ringing, the house isn't burning down, no explosions, just parallel lives, slowly becoming strangers, busy, tired, logistical. The drift is subtle. And that's what makes it insidiously powerful. This household is teaching our kids that connection just kind of naturally fades. It's part of the process. That's just what happens in marriage. And these kids often enter their own relationships waiting for that, almost expecting it, and might build up their own walls of like, if this is going to end, like, why am I going to put myself out there? What's the point of that? You know, because it's not going to last. So I fully understand that this is one, maybe the most sensitive thing we could be talking about on our lunch breaks of all things today. But two, that this isn't the right forum for maybe some call and response, question and answer. Unmute yourself and let's talk about this. I fully understand that. But I still want to give you the opportunity to think and consider some of this. So I'm going to give us just a moment or so, and I want to ask you for a little private reflection. And firstly, I think it's a lot easier. Instead of kind of pointing the finger at us, we can maybe turn the mirror out for a moment and think about the home you grew up in. Think about your parents or the adult relationship in that house. What was that pattern of conflict and repair where you grew up? You know, maybe another way of asking it is in my home growing up, love felt like blank. How would you finish that sentence? You know, and then also think about your home right now. What is our pattern of conflict and repair? In our home right now, what does love feel like? So again, I'm going to give us just a few seconds to think about it. You can write it down. You can put it in your notes app if you want, but just starting the brainstorming a little bit. Because again, I fully respect and understand that we don't need to go into all this right now with a bunch of strangers. And I'll certainly mention this again at the end as I send y'all home with a little bit of homework, we might say. Um, so I want to ask you something harder now. If your teen, your kid, were to describe your marriage to their future spouse, partner, 20 years from now, let's call it, what would they say? Not what you hope they'd say, but if you had the opportunity to kind of step outside yourself, think from their perspective, maybe based on what your kid sees every day, what would that be? How would you describe it? How would they describe it? Would they describe to people who genuinely liked each other? Yeah, argued a little bit, had some conflict, but came back, maybe faced hard stuff together, but they worked to stay connected through it? Or would we describe some of those household patterns that we just looked at? Two competent adults who maybe managed life well, were successful in a lot of these other arenas, but slowly became strangers to each other. And I bring this up because I don't know, it's a fun calling where I found myself in kind of the sweet spot. The stuff I love to do as a therapist is basically, all of the stuff that a lot of the average therapists absolutely run away from. The average therapist, like couples therapy is a very scary concept. And even more so, working with teen boys is also a very scary thing for a lot of therapists. And that's my jam. I love both of those things. That's what lights me up, you know. And got that unique perspective of talking with teen boys that go to Westlake, kind of about what's going on at home, what's going on in the parents' relationship, and also working with, parents at Westlake who about what's going on in their relationship and what's going on with their teen. Kind of seeing both sides of the story, the three sides of the truth, we might say. Um, but I don't think you all would be surprised by how many couples I work with who get to that empty nest phase of life. You know, Kids moved out off to college. We did it. Mission accomplished, And they wake up one morning, nobody else at home but them, and they say, I don't even know you anymore. And I probably don't even like you. And while it's a heartbreaking thing, it's also maybe the saddest part is that it's almost completely avoidable. And another just kind of crazy thing is the average couple that I work with, it's not in crisis. Again, the house isn't burning down. They're managing. Kids are, again, making it to soccer practice. It's like we've got solid SAT scores. The bills are paid. But managing is not the same as love. Managing is not the same as thriving, of course. And your kids, whether we want to admit it to ourselves or not, they can feel the difference even when you think they can't. Even when you're like, they're just on their phone or they're up playing Fortnite. They still feel it. They feel that emotional temperature of your marriage, to use that phrase again. So, this is not some doom and gloom, we can't do anything about it, might as well just throw our hands up conversation. I think the biggest reason why I'm, again, just absolutely filled up to be talking about this with you all is because there's actually a lot we can do about this. And again, if the ultimate goal, or probably the reason you showed up today, is because you want to talk to your kids about what a healthy relationship looks like, you know, this is the process. This is very much, uh, to use the kind of goofy analogy, this is like the airplane oxygen mask dynamic of we have to put our own oxygen mask on. We've got to help our own relationship before we're going to help our kids' relationship. Because again, back to the very beginning, that's the single biggest predictor of what their relationship is going to look like, you know? So again, our marriage as parents, that's the template, that's the blueprint for them. So what actually strengthens it? So we're going to go a little bit from theory to practice now, and we're going to run through what I think are some simple but powerful I would call it couples therapy 101. Some techniques here, and I would bet the house that if you're going to choose one of these, dig in, focus on over the next month, it's going to noticeably move the needle in your relationship. So let's get into it. Solutions. So, a name we've already said and heard before, the great John and Julie Gottman. One of the things that if I'm thinking about the toolkit that I help people build as couples, this is almost at the top of the list. This is the Gottman's magic relationship ratio. And what he found is that if the ratio of a positive to a negative experience in a relationship is 1 to 1, even 2 to 1, even two positives for a negative, what they found is that relationship, that two positives, one negative, that relationship is heading for divorce or some, again, kind of quiet drift situation, which is crazy to think about. But also, if we stop and think, it makes a lot of sense because we as human beings, our brains are absolutely wired to focus on the negative, to focus on what isn't working, to focus on the pain, right? And maybe another dumb example, but if our boss or, if we're in some more career corporate setting, if we were going to get 100 things of we're doing right, but there's one negative thing, that negative thing, that one out of 100 is going to be the thing that gets us, some loss of sleep, the thing that we're going to really rack our brains over. And of course, that's just in work, which at the end of the day is like, all right, it's work. At home, in our most intimate setting, it's so much more magnified. Those one or two little interactions are so more magnified and painful, which is why they said that the magic ratio, it's got to be 5 to 1. It has to be five of these positive interactions for every one negative interaction, you know? And I think, again, setting the standard here, it doesn't have to be some grand gesture. This isn't like we have to go to Cabo. This could be very small things, you know, acknowledgement, appreciation, humor, laughing together, having a hug after a long day, turning towards each other when the easiest thing to do is turning away. You know, these are called bids in the Gottman vocabulary. A bid is just a small attempt for connection, turning towards even briefly. And our kids are learning security not from these big dramatic moments, not from the family vacations. They're learning it from do mom and dad, like, do our parents, do they have a good time together? You know, which brings us to another great Gottman tool, which is repair, which I said we'd come back to. Um, and I put their definition here because I think it's important to read out loud. It's a repair attempt is any statement or action, silly or otherwise, that prevents negativity from escalating out of control. And just reading that, we all know exactly what I'm talking about. We all know there's kind of a moment in some of these disconnects, in some of these conversations when we're kind of at the fork in the road. We can make it a little light. We can go in this one direction, or we can double or triple down. And repair, as the Gottman say, is essentially the A/B test for what is the quality of our relationship. How often do we do that? And I put some examples here on the board. Like it can look like a lot of things. That came out wrong. One of my favorites is I'm probably just hungry. I need a snack. This actually probably doesn't really matter to me. Let's revisit in 20 minutes. Like it does not need to be some deeply profound PhD level statement. It's something to just cut the tension. And again, when our kids are seeing this, our kids who see that repair, they're not afraid of conflict. They don't avoid conflict or they don't have these massive swells of anxiety about conflict because they trust that, all right, yeah, we can disagree, we can have an argument, but we're going to come back together. We're going to recover. Another Gottman tool, soften language. This is a fun one as well. One of the strongest predictors of how a conflict ends, as you can probably guess, is how it begins. In the Gottman world, they call this the harsh startup, right? Like if we're thinking about our own kind of 0 to 10 scale for how escalated or dysregulated or pissed we are coming into a conversation, if we're starting at a 7 or an 8, it's highly unlikely we're gonna, have some Jinkies moment and come back down to a 2 or a 3, which is why they place such an emphasis. And it's so important that, you know, we be very cognizant, hyper aware of how we start some of these conversations. And again, I put a maybe a silly little example on the board here of like these always statements. They talk about harsh startups as, always, never. What's wrong with you? Why can't you just blank? Like at that point, we're not going to have a good conversation. If it's starting like that, it's going to take almost a miracle for us to turn around. Because, and this is also a huge part of what I work with teens and, adults on is when we hear those kind of words, that language, those harsh startups, our nervous system, our own fight or flight switch or our freeze switch, that activates almost immediately. When I hear, you never this, like I'm already, getting my sword and shield out. I'm getting my defense mechanisms ready. So instead of something like you never help around the house, we have to bring it back down to a more emotional level of like, what's actually going on with me? I'm feeling stressed thin. I'm feeling stretched thin. I'm stressed out. Can we look at how we're dividing things? Yeah. And this brings us to um, moving away from the Gottmans. This is an exercise which, if you're only going to practice one of these, and I'm sure I will absolutely share with Brooke and Katie and our amazing counseling team this PowerPoint just so you can have this. And I've got another resource and guide at the end that I'll share with you all. But if you all only take one screenshot or snapshot or, write one thing down, I would challenge you with this one. And this is from one of my heroes, a guy named Terry Real, who is, for my money, one of the greatest living therapists and thinkers about relationships. Terry Real talks about relational integrity, and it means um, we have to stop protecting our ego and start protecting the relationship. Because most conflict, as we all know at this point, it's not about being right, it's about feeling hurt and then protecting ourselves, doing anything to not feel shame, not feel bad. So if you're open to it, my challenge, which we'll revisit here, but I want to challenge you all to take this with you from here. This is a brilliant exercise to try sometime this week because it works around a real issue in our life. So I'll walk you through since it's a little needs a little more spice than just what's on the slides. So the first step is always like instead of starting with, what they're doing, what your husband, wife, partner, whoever is doing, start with this sentence. When this happens, when you do this, I tell myself a story that blank. For example, silly example. When you're late, I tell myself a story that I'm not important to you, you know? And that doesn't matter if it's objectively true or false. That's how I feel. And that's the story that I tell myself. And why this is important is because that takes us out of, thinking our experience is objective and acknowledges that, you know, we're interpreting this. We're making assumptions, which is a huge part of conflict. Secondly, like we have to own our own protection pattern. When I feel that way, when I feel like you don't value my time or you don't think I'm important, do I feel superior? Like want to criticize or lecture? Do I feel like a victim? Do I withdraw? Do I sulk? Do I get controlling? Do I try to micromanage? Do I escalate things? Or do I just disappear completely? Do I avoid the situation? You know, like when I feel unimportant to you, I get avoidant. I leave, or whatever your pattern is. This is real accountability. Like this is how I show up. This is how you show up. This is the building blocks of like how we're going to change this, and then step three being, here's what I actually need. What I actually need is like, again, if we're thinking about the time thing, your partner being late, like I need to feel like I actually matter to you. I need just a little reassurance, and that's a hard step because that takes some vulnerability. That takes some like, I need this thing from you, you know. And lastly, it's not a you need to change request. It's, when you're running late, you just shoot me a text. Because otherwise, I do the thing where I tell a story and I do the thing where I, get avoidant. Like that is this exercise again, if we get nothing else from, no other takeaways, like this is I think, one of the most powerful take home couples therapy exercises. Um, because again, if we are bringing our kids back into focus here, like our kids are not learning emotional maturity only if we, never get triggered. They're learning what it means to be emotionally mature by watching parents who own some of that, who own their triggers, without blaming or without doing one of those, you know, I get out of here, or I want to start micromanaging, or I get my sword and shield out and become defensive. So, one last little exercise, which I will challenge you all with. This is something that I personally work on, and also something that I talk to all of my couples about is um, we need a meeting. Not another meeting, but we do need to check in. I think the most successful, loving, connected relationships that I've seen in my personal and professional life, they have some kind of way of checking in on a weekly basis and doing a quick temperature check on what's going on in the relationship. Another thing I often tell couples is there should be a 1 week statute of limitations for something that has happened in the relationship. If something has happened more than a week ago, I can't help you. That's on you because you have to bring that stuff up. And what this weekly check-in can do is, yes, we need to practice some of that Gottman, 5-to-1 magic ratio. We need to share the good stuff which is happening, the appreciation. I see you doing this for us. I love that. Thank you. But we also need the repetition. We need to strengthen the muscle of, hey, this thing happened this week and maybe you didn't mean it, but that hurt. And we need the opportunity to repair from that and ask for something, and also the ability to connect in that way as well. So, um, what I'm going to leave you all with, and I know that we will, I'm certainly happy to stick around and get into some Q&A if you feel comfortable asking some more general questions. Um, but what I want to share as we kind of wrap this up again is like, you know, that's it takes a lot of courage to talk about any of this. And frankly, the fact that, you know, 30 plus of you all are in here doing this on a random Wednesday, like I know there's a million more um, kind of pressing things that are going on in life. And what I really want to challenge you on is that, like, oftentimes I'm a believer in simple tweaks, simple, degree changes can exponentially change the trajectory of our relationship. Because again, I know the average person here, I would say probably the large majority of you, like nothing is in crisis. The house is burning down. No one's throwing stuff across the room, you know. And back to the perspective from our kids, they're very well still picking up on some of the cool temperature. Maybe it's a little too hot temperature sometimes. you know. And again, what we can get back to is, which I, again, maybe sounds like hyperbole, but I really believe it, is that what we're talking about here today is the greatest gift that you can give your kid. It's the model, the blueprint for this is what love should look like. This is what a healthy relationship should look like. And I know we live in a crazy world. We live in a crazy part of town, which it's very easy to prioritize the stuff which is way more in our face. I've got to drive 4 times across town to do X, Y, and Z after 5 o'clock, or we've got, you know, GPA and SATs and all this, of course, important stuff to focus on. And what I want to leave you all with, what I want to challenge you all on, and what I want to challenge you to get this guide and continue your own thinking and conversations with your spouse and your relationship is what is that template that we're giving them, you know? And before they leave, before they go out into the world to do their own life, to have their own relationships, how could we give them the strongest possible template, blueprint for what all of this should look like? So again, that's the challenge. And I really appreciate all of you, each and every one of you, for being here and talking about an uncomfortable conversation, you know. But again, back to what I said at the beginning, it does us very little good to focus on, how our kids are showing up in relationships without addressing the root of it all, which is what is that model I'm giving them, you know? So, like I said, I'm happy to stick around. And if there are some questions in the chat, Brooke or Katie, um, please read them out and I'm happy to get into it with y'all. Thanks.
Okay, Mike, that
Awesome.
was, oh, Brooke's on too. That
I
was,
know. Sorry.
no,
I did
that's
want to
fine.
get to the
Um,
question because it only got sent to me. So
okay,
that's why I wanted to make sure. Sorry, I'm
good.
trying to put my video on. Oh, you know. Okay, so someone asked a really great question. And so I wanted to see if you had an answer for it, Mike. But they said that they've had instances, and this was when you were talking about not saying directly to the person, like, you're always on your phone or you do this, to say, like, the I feel or I need. And the response that they get is it's always about you. And so their thought was, how do you suggest handling that when they're trying to explain their feelings and then it's turned back? Well, it's always about you.
That's a really good question. And let's be honest, that if we get to a certain point in the relationship, or, I often talk about some of this stuff is a snowball. And the easiest time to stop a snowball is when it's at the top of the mountain. And I think the large majority of this would have loved to had this conversation when we were in, high school or college, or when we were starting out in this journey or our own relationships. But it is what it is. Like, not all that wasn't top of mind, or we didn't always have this information, and I certainly believe that some of these skills, some of these tools are easier kind of earlier on in the relationship, or when, the snowball is a little farther uphill, right? I acknowledge that some of these things, some of these conversations and tools are a little more like band-aids and vitamins when in reality we're actually needing something a little heavier. We're needing something a little more like surgery. So, but I would back to the, question you're bringing up. Maybe that's just signaling that, wow, for good or ill, like this is something that's really hard for us to even talk about. Like the meta, like to step out of like, man, it's really hard to even talk about how we talk about this, which signals to me that that's a conversation that needs to be had, maybe not in the moment, because, in the moment it sure seems like our conflict pattern, like we just go right into the thing without the awareness or, you know, pause to not put up those shields and get into things, which again signals to me of like maybe that looks like, I need to go to my husband, wife, spouse and say, hey, I really want to talk about something. Can we schedule a time? Because clearly, maybe in real time, in the kind of the stress and chaos of our life, it's really hard. So we need to kind of set this time aside. And maybe that's on one of these family, weekly check-ins. Maybe it's on a date night or something along those lines. But we need to create some time where we can actually talk and look at the thing. And again, thinking about some of those other tools of when you do that, when you say it's about me, this is the story that I tell. And maybe that story is like, man, are we ever going to be able to figure this out? Or, we can, like, what we're trying to get to is how can we create a time and space to have the bigger picture conversation? Because in the weeds, it's not working. It's not happening.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. I have one other question, Mike. They said, I realize this is a bit off topic, but they're hoping that you can help. What about the children of divorce? How do we help our kids? How can us who have divorced repair the relationship with our former spouse so we can give our grown high school and college kids a more positive experience going forward? And that's a great question because obviously there's many families that fall into that situation.
Absolutely. So again, I was lost in thought for a second because I was thinking like, yes, I'm a child of divorce. Maybe the
Hmm.
presentation feels a little, it's not necessarily a marriage. We could just as much be talking in some ways about, co-parenting. I think a lot of this is apples to apples here. Some of it, of course, is a little different, but I think there's a lot of application for both. So I'm sorry, Brooke, could you
Absolutely. So the question
remember the
just
question?
is, when you are, when you have children and you are a divorced parent, how do you help the kids? How can us who have divorce repair the relationship with our former spouse that we can give our grown kids, a more positive experience? Like, what are some ways to maybe do that?
Hmm. Yeah, great question. And I've got some just fun lived and I work with a lot of folks that are either going through divorce or have recently gotten divorced. Like this is um, a really appropriate question as well because I'm a big believer, again, maybe from a personal place, but also in the work that I do, that like divorce is in no means a um, you know, death toll to what our kids' attachment style is going to be. And I think what we often forget as parents is that when our kids go through a really difficult thing, divorce being one of them, like statistically, the majority response of that kid is going to be building resilience. And I think that that's just something we need on more billboards around here. Our kids can very well, build resilience because for my money, like I think the thing that your kid wants most is to see you live a happy, joyful, connected, fulfilled life. And that can look like marriage. That can also look like divorce and finding something else. But speaking to the co-parenting conversation, while there's certainly things to do, I think probably the more important thing is the stuff we don't want to do. And I'm a huge believer of the greatest gift that you can give your kid if you're going through a separation or a divorce is not to talk crap about the other parent. It's as really as simple as that. And to try, and I know that this is a difficult and painful thing, try to always give that other parent in the positive light when you're talking to your kids. That's kind of the bedrock of how to maybe use some of what we're talking about here when it comes to a divorce or a co-parenting relationship, you know. Additionally, um, I think also recognizing that in some ways, I know this is the apples to oranges to whether we're married, whether we're divorced and co-parenting, but I think a similar thing of like setting time aside to like we have stuff that we have to work out about how we're handling either our relationship and what that shows the kids or what, how we talk to the kids about this thing. Like that's a worthwhile conversation. And, I think a beautiful thing about maybe where we're getting to as a society and is like I've seen co-parents do couples therapy. I've seen co-parents do, co-parenting therapy. Like because at the end of the day, I think the best divorced parents, they prioritize the kid. They don't make this about like I have to be right or, make this you're the villain here. Like the best co-parents prioritize the kid. And if that means like we have to talk to somebody to help navigate and figure out the situation, like that's what the best co-parents do. And maybe it's a longer conversation. I don't want to, ramble on forever, but I know that can also be difficult if the other person doesn't see it that way, And maybe that's where you invest in your own work, your own therapy, your own, talking to friends and family about how to navigate that.
There's any other questions, feel free to put it in the chat. If you don't feel comfortable putting it to everyone, you can send it to me and I can read it. Um, we're happy to use this time. I'm going to download your QR code right now. Now that I didn't see that until now, so I'm definitely going to do that. We did record this, and so we will be putting it up on our Healthy Shaps website. And then we'll probably put something in the newsletter to remind parents that it's once it's up. Do hang tight. We are not tech savvy, so it'll take us a little bit to get that up and going, but maybe our amazing interns who, they're the phone generation, maybe they'll be able to help us. But thank you so, so much. Any last questions? Okay. Well, Mike, we cannot thank you enough. This was so great to have you on for our inaugural, healthy relationships series. So we really, really appreciate you. And we really appreciate all the parents that took time out of their busy days to come as well. So please feel free to reach out to either Katie or myself with any follow-up questions. And then Mike obviously has his information on there as well. So again, thank you and hope everyone has a great rest of their Wednesday.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for being here.
All right, Mike, I don't know how to turn this recording off, so I'm just gonna probably end the Zoom, okay?
Perfect.
Oh, it
Well,
says I sent Mike a question. There's someone that sent you a direct question. I don't know if you have time to.
oh yeah, let's see it. Yes, I will respond to that. Someone asked, is it okay to talk to kids openly about parents' relationships, both good and bad? That's a tough conversation and maybe a non-answer, which I can give a little more detail in, is like I would say it depends. And what I would add on to that is that again, in the spirit of a lot of what we're talking about is I think it's fully appropriate and healthy even for your kids to know that mom and dad do not have some perfect relationship or we don't, or the parents in the house, there's no like perfect relationship. I think, if we want to think about the flip side, there can be some tough, difficult, um, maybe delusion that comes from that as well, right? Because, I've got some family and friends who like they grew up in households where like mom, dad never fought and, like that's its own kind of can of worms. But I really think that um, it's more than appropriate for your kids to know that like mom and dad fight, but again, mom and dad also figure things out. We as parents navigate and again, most importantly, probably the theme of this whole conversation is we're going to work through it. We're going to repair. And just because we argue, it's not going to, you know, be a death toll. It's not going to be the end of the world. Like we have the maturity and capacity to work through that, you know. Maybe speaking to another part of your question is it okay to kind of sit your kids down and let them know that mom and dad are going or, parents are going through tough times? Again, I think that is a little more um, kind of dependent on some other factors, frankly. I think a big one is, the age of the kids, right? I also think their own level of emotional maturity. Is that just kind of what we do in the house? Do we talk about these kind of things? Because I think just if generally we don't talk about those kind of things and we're just opening up this can of worms, that can be a little disorienting to a teenager, So again, my non-answer is I think that's something that depends, frankly. But if that's something worth emailing about, I'm happy to weigh a little more in if I had a little more information.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I don't see any other questions. And Brooke had to hop off, so hopefully nobody sent any to her. But appreciate you being here. I thought it was super helpful. I wish you could see me and my husband. Um, yes, like Brooke said, we will post this, and if you guys have any questions, reach out to Brooke and I. We have Barb Steinberg on tomorrow at noon, and then next, I think it's Tuesday or Wednesday, the 25th, we have Mike Brooks. Okay, thanks everybody for joining.
Katie Brooke, thanks so much. Have a
Bye.
Bye.